I would like to open the final session of this conference, of this symposium. It's titled Costs of Saving Species. And our first speaker today is Dr. Ursula Heise. She is a professor of English at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. That's in Los Angeles for us Canadians. Dr. Heise has been a Guggenheim Fellow in the year 2011-2012. She has been the president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment in 2011. Her research focuses on contemporary literature, environmental culture in the Americas, Western Europe and Japan, literature and science, globalization theory, and media theory. Her books include some fascinating titles here: Chronoschisms, Time, Narrative, and Postmodernism from 1997, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, published by Oxford University Press in 2008. Another book in German, I will give the English translation, After Nature, Species, Extinction, and Modern Culture, from 2011. She is an editor of the series Literatures, Cultures, and the Environment with Palgrave Macmillan, co-editor of the series Literature and Contemporary Thought with Routledge, and she is currently working on a book titled Where the Wild Things Used to Be, Narrative, Database, and Endangered Species. Today, Dr. Heise is going to speak to us on the topic of legally gone, endangered species and culture. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Heise.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Brett and the other organizers for letting me be part of what's truly been an amazing 3 days. So my work over the last few years has focused on how biodiversity and endangered species are culturally represented in various media, and that goes all the way from novels and poetry and video games to music, films, photography, as well as on websites and in databases. Recently, it's also included endangered species laws, and that's what I'll focus on today. But I'd like to explain first some of the broader conceptual background that has shaped this work and that I see myself in dialogue with, and that shapes sort of some of the tensions that come up in it. Specifically, this is the tension between two major terms around which discussions of environmental crisis in the humanities, in the social sciences, and also in environmentalism at large currently revolve, and that's the Anthropocene and varieties of posthumanism. So what I'm going to do is just talk about that by way of introduction. I think Matthew already brought up the notion of the Anthropocene anyway, and then I'm going to sort of just give a very brief history of endangered species laws as they've evolved in the United States and in Germany, and then focus in on two specific points of comparison in terms of what these laws are meant to protect. Species or biodiversity, endangered species or biodiversity, and species or landscapes. And I'll then, in the last part, sort of branch out a little bit to look at the EU laws that Germany's obviously have to conform to, and talk about nationalism, internationalism, and I'll double back sort of at the very end to the question of the position of the human and the post-human. And the concept of the Anthropocene obviously is known to all of you. It was coined in 2000 in a short article by the ecologist Eugene Stormer and the atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen. Their intent was, as you know, to signal the magnitude of the transformations that humans have wrought on the planet over roughly the last 200 years. Humans' impact has been so pervasive and so enduring, is what they argue, that it now registers even in the geological strata, and therefore the current era should no longer be considered part of the Holocene, which we've lived in for the last 12,000 years, but should be considered a new era, the human age or Anthropocene. Now the geologists will take until about 2017 to consider the evidence and see if it warrants this change of name. They're understandably cautious about a new geological era that's only lasted 200 years, a blink of an eye for them. But in the meantime, the term has circulated widely. There's now at least 2 journals that deal with this concept. There have been multiple conferences, symposia, and exhibitions by major research institutions, foundations, and museums in North America, in Europe, in Australia. And literary critics, as well as historians and geographers, have begun to discuss the term, and it's also popped up in the popular press. But when you listen to these discussions about the Anthropocene inside and outside of North America, 2 somewhat different interpretations of it emerge. So if you look at Crutzen's own description in a follow-up essay called Geology of Mankind, he sort of runs through a whole catalog of human transformations, all the way from population growth to increase of methane emissions, exploitation of the land surface, disappearance of rainforests. He mentioned species extinction in that context, and on and on. Dam building, fisheries exploitation, and so on and so forth. And it's a long catalog. Now, this is phrased sort of as just a sober statement of facts, but in its accumulation, this catalog seems to define the Anthropocene as the sum of all environmental havocs that humans have wreaked on the planet. So from this perspective, it sounds as if the Anthropocene is merely a new word to mark the endpoint of typical environmental narratives of decline, the hell where nature is going in the proverbial handbasket. But now, if the Anthropocene hypothesis were just a restatement of familiar apocalyptic narratives, I don't think it would have gotten the traction that it has. A different view emerges in the numerous publications of the geographer Earl Ellis and various collaborators. So he says human influence on the terrestrial biosphere is by now pervasive. Most of nature is now embedded within anthropogenic mosaics of land use and land cover. While not intended to replace existing biome systems based on climate, terrain, and geology, we hope that wide availability of an anthropogenic biome system, which they call anthrome, will encourage a richer view of human ecosystem interactions, and that this will in turn help us manage ecosystems. And other researchers also have talked about this, though the vocabularies differ a little bit. So Peter Kariva, the scientific director of the Nature Conservancy, and with other biologists, has talked about domesticated nature. The biologist Richard Hobbs has talked about substituting the term intervention ecology for the more traditional one called restoration ecology, and along with that, the suggestion that we should focus on the novel ecosystems that have at least in part been created by humans. So a whole array of terms that all have to do with the humanly reshaped planet. The science writer Emma Maris popularized these ideas in her widely discussed and controversial book Rambunctious Gardens, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. And I think it's ideas such as these that the Anthropocene has become a shorthand for. And now when you look at what people say about the Anthropocene in these and other publications, it turns out that there's an odd mix of description and prescription. And that becomes a little more obvious when you look at an op-ed piece that Emma Maris did in co-authorship with Earl Ellis, Kariva, and Joseph Mascaro in the New York Times a couple of years ago. It was called Hope in the Age of Man, and here they say, the Anthropocene does not represent the failure of environmentalism. It is the stage on which a new, more positive and forward-looking environmentalism can be built. This is the Earth we have created, and we have a duty as a species to protect it and manage it with love and intelligence. It is not ruined. It is beautiful and can even be more beautiful if we work together and care for it. The environmental blogger Andy Revkin, who writes the well-known blog .earth, echoes the sentiment in a post called Embracing the Anthropocene. So he says, one clear reality is that for a long time to come, Earth is what we choose to make of it, for better or worse. Taking full ownership of the Anthropocene won't be easy. The necessary feeling is a queasy mix of excitement and unease. That's a very different sensation than, say, mourning the end of nature. It's more a celebration in a way, a deeper acceptance of our place on the planet with all of our synthetic trappings and our faults as fundamentally natural. So for Revkin, as for these other researchers, the Anthropocene is a new environmental orientation toward the future rather than the past, celebration rather than mourning, and a new sense that humans are able to transform the planet, combined with a belief in the human ability to make the planet what we want it to be. And that sense of celebration and optimism is even more obvious at the end of Maris's Rambunctious Garden, where she concludes by saying, "We forever altered the earth, and so now we cannot abandon it to a random fate. It is our duty to manage it. Luckily, it can be a pleasant, even joyful task if we embrace it in the right spirit. Let the rambunctious gardening begin." And I think it's in this context, actually, that such ideas about de-extinction, as Stuart Brand has proposed them in his TED Talks, actually take on some of their resonance. It is this idea that we're going to shape the future of the planet. Now, on one hand, I find it very hard not at some level to sympathize with the future orientation and the optimism of these writers, especially since I've often in the past criticized environmental discourse for its nostalgia, its elegiac moods, and for the latent misanthropy and the reverence for wilderness. And yet, I think it gives one pause to see the concept of the Anthropocene interpreted as we've managed nature anyway, it's all human now, so let's go ahead and manage it better. That leaves out two things, I think. It leaves out those large-scale natural phenomena which humans have absolutely no control over, and which Nigel Clarke has beautifully illuminated in his book, In Human Nature. From the sunlight that we depend on to the earthquakes that endanger our cities, nature remains resolutely non-human in a lot of ways. But secondly, and more importantly, it also leaves out that some of the most fundamental human transformations of the planet that have taken place outside of our intention and control. So climate change, toxification, and biodiversity loss, to name the three really large ones, or intended by anyone, but came about as the side effect of other activities. Many of them were so distributed over millions of humans that they weren't even visible to us for a long time. So it seems kind of like a fairly large non sequitur to argue from this circumstance that we should now go forth and manage joyfully in the confident belief that we're actually able to foresee and control the consequences of our management. This affirmative reading of humans' place, also in human agency, also conflicts with recent attempts in the humanities and social sciences to rethink the centrality of the. I don't mean here just the attention to material conditions, to places, to our relations with non-human species, and to our dependence on natural resources that have characterized environmental philosophy, environmental history, biological anthropology, my own field, eco-criticism, and cultural geography for several decades already. I mean the more radical shift over the last decade and a half or so to new materialisms, new vitalisms, thing theories, object ontologies, and critical animal and plant studies. Now these come in a great variety here, and as you can see, I've just sort of listed them on this slide for you, and I can't explore these in detail here. Some of them emphasize how blurry the boundary is between the human body and the environment, so they focus on flows of air, food, toxins, microbes, and so forth. Others highlight how difficult it really is to make any categorical distinctions between humans and animals, and infer from this that we need to make changes in our species' dismissal of other species' claim to moral consideration. Yet others are concerned with the agency of matter or objects or systems, the way in which, for example, a simple statement like, "I'm going back to Los Angeles tomorrow," depends on a multitude of systems, substances, objects, processes, and institutions, some of which I control only partially or not at all. Caffeine, wheat, aspirin, gasoline, rubber, asphalt, highways, car manufacturers, air traffic control, schedules, luggage, cell phone networks, to name just a few. So these theories come in a lot of different stripes, but I think it is fair to say that most of them involve implicitly or explicitly a critique of the liberal human subject of the Enlightenment. So the basic idea that humans are separable from the natural world, and at least in principle capable of knowing and controlling large parts of the non-human world. Anthropologists have been hesitant to adopt the concept of posthumanism, not just because the name seems to run a little bit against the name of their discipline, but also because they work in a very different context, obviously. The European Enlightenment, which is the backdrop against which many variants of posthumanist theory have been formulated, is a good deal less salient when you deal with the cosmologies and the social structures of societies where Enlightenment ideas never had a foothold in the first place. But anthropologists have, in fact, been interested in thinking across species boundaries in ways that parallel some of the environmental philosophers and literary critics who have named their theories posthumanist. So Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which started out in the 1980s with its interest in the material as well as semiotic relationships between what Latour and Calon and Law called actants, so not actors, not human actors alone, is of course the precursor for a lot of this work and many of these current theories. And some of these have already been named. So in Belgium and France, Dominique Lestel and Vincent Després have proposed ethnoethnology or ethnoethology as a new way of combining the study of human behavior with that of animals, and that was already mentioned this morning. We have the zooanthropologia or anthrozoology or human animal studies that Mark Cassini has protagonized. And then in the US and Australia, people like Eben Kirksey, Stefan Helmreich, Anna Tsing, and of course Deborah Bird-Rose have begun to explore what they call multi-species ethnography, multi-species writing, to bring non-humans forcefully into the study of human societies and cultures. And all of this is also, of course, influenced by Donna Haraway's theory of companion species, and then really, possibly the most radical of these theories are the ones proposed by Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro on perspectival multinaturalism. So my own work on how biodiversity loss, endangered and extinct species are culturally represented has evolved against that background tension between the new emphasis on human agency in discussions about the Anthropocene and these sort of humanistic and social scientific attempts to see human agency as just part of a network of forces and agencies, some of which are human and some not. And with that tension in mind, I've tried to explore how we express our concern over other species and how do we portray our own responsibility. I started out with relatively standard material for literary and cultural studies. How has the concern over endangered species manifested itself across different media and institutional frameworks? There are literally dozens of documentaries, scores of websites, hundreds of books, and thousands of photographs that have brought the general biodiversity crisis and the fate of, in particular, endangered species to the general public. And I've just put a very small selection here of just some books on this slide. So typically they focus on animals rather than plants, usually vertebrates rather than invertebrates, and for the most part, the large mammals and birds that humans find impressive or attractive. In most cases, these works want to mobilize readers' and viewers' empathy for animals at risk, and they also want to mobilize a certain nostalgia and mourning for the richer and more beautiful nature of the past, with the typical story templates and rhetorical strategies of elegy and tragedy. Sometimes, and then after I had done that work, and I increasingly was talking to biologists, I realized that they, of course, were not so interested in the books and the photographs, but many of them very much engaged in setting up databases as a foundation for even knowing how many species there are, how many we're losing, and so forth. So intense and often very passionate taxonomic logging effort. I've just put a few of important global biodiversity databases on here. There are, of course, a multitude of others at the national and regional levels. Looking at these databases with a literary scholar's eye, they're not, for the most part, in the same sense, but obey an epic or encyclopedic impulse. Along with that, I became interested in red lists as a particular kind of database, the sort of list that focuses on animals and plants at risk rather than biodiversity at large. And now these red lists, of course, often are tools that are incorporated in legislation to protect species issued by states, nations, or international organizations, or they give substance to international treaties. And so that's how I became interested in environmental laws and biodiversity laws in particular. Now, these laws and international treaties are two of the main tools global society has developed to deal with environmental crises, biodiversity loss prominent among them. Laws for the protection of endangered species emerged in most countries sometime between the 1960s and the 1980s, and that was obviously a response to the pressure of environmentalist movements around the globe. International treaties forced the countries to sign on to them to adopt certain ideas and policies. So when I started this research, my assumption was that would sound more or less the same, no matter which country you looked at. There is some truth to that. There are some basic ideas that repeat themselves. But I was surprised to find that endangered species laws in different countries do often sound actually quite different. And when you ask why they differ, they actually turn out to engage with and to come out of quite different national and cultural histories. And so my interest here is that is in figuring out how to understand current engagements with endangered species and biodiversity loss as outcomes of particular cultural histories. And I think we cannot understand the current engagement without knowing something about those histories. So let me just run through this very briefly. My two cases here that I'll focus on for today is going to be the US and Germany. Look at some other pieces which we can talk about, but that research is not quite as developed, so I'll only allude to it. The concern with endangered species and species extinction, you all know. So for this audience, I'm going to go through this. I mean, all the way from the belief in the early 19th century that there could be no extinction because God would not allow any creatures that he himself had created to vanish, to the discovery of fossils, gradual acceptance of Darwinian theory, establishment of associations for the protection of wildlife, mostly in Africa around the turn of the 20th century, and then on to what we've already heard at this conference, the new emphasis on mass extinctions in the 70s and 80s, the passing of CITES, the coining of the term biodiversity, and the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity. Most of you are also probably quite familiar with the U.S. History of engagement with endangered species. The concern for wildlife paired from the early 19th century onward with a focus on wilderness, and what conservationists mostly, not only, but mostly wanted to preserve were areas considered to be pristine, mostly free of human intervention, however fictitious that pristineness might retrospectively have turned out to be. And Josh Schuster has already talked about the concern over the near extinction of the American bison and the passenger pigeon as sort of turning points that gave new urgency to conservation, led to the passage of the Lacey Act in 1900, and then to various acts and treaties protecting migratory birds in the 19-teens and 20s. In 1942, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published Fading Trails, the story of endangered American wildlife, and then with wide publicity and annual counts of that surrounded the alarming decrease of whooping cranes, the Department of the Interior established the Committee on Rare and Endangered Wildlife Species in 1964. This committee published the first Red Book of 331 endangered species in 1966, and the federal government passed the Endangered Species Preservation Act in the same year. The ESPCA, as well as its successor, the Endangered Species Conservation Act from 1969, focused mainly on habitat protection and also began to regulate commerce that might endanger wildlife. And then, of course, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, encouraged by President Nixon, passed with unanimity in the Senate and overwhelming majority in the House of Representatives, reflecting a shared perception that none of these laws had yet done enough to really halt species decrease. Very hard to imagine that kind of consensus, let alone on anything environmental these days. So the original ESA of 1973 was then substantially modified several times over the following decades. Significant amendments in 1978 and 1979 that added the procedures for listing a particular species, and also, importantly, required that critical habitat be listed along with a species, and then more amendments, which I'm not going to go into here, during the 1990s. So that's sort of where we're at in the United States today. Meantime, back at the ranch in Germany, rapid population, so it starts sort of a little bit later, but around the same time, especially in the last decade of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th, rapid population growth, industrialization, and explosive growth of cities in these 2 decades triggered a turn to nature and against modernization, urbanization, and mass society. So there was a lot of founding of a lot of utopian colonies and a wide variety of movements revolving around organic food, alternative medicine, vegetarianism, teetotalism, nudism, sexual reform, gardening, and hiking, all meant to bring Germans back in touch with nature. In 1897, the composer Ernst Rudolph coined the term Naturschutz, protection of nature, and used the term Heimatschutz, protection of the homeland, as watchwords for the return to nature. And then I've just put a whole bunch of dates on this slide that you don't need to focus on in detail, but just to impress upon you how there was a whole slew of national organizations that were founded and a whole spate of publications on conservation that occurred all in this sort of 10 or 20 year period. I do want to point you to Robert Mielke's coining of the term Landesliga, which literally means care for the land, or more contemporarily land management, in 1907. That's a term that will come back in the rest of my talk because it's stayed around. Now, the concept of an idealized world, and I should, there's also the Verein Naturschutzpark, is a very lasting organization as well. Anyway, so in all of this sort of explosion of concern for nature, the concept of an idealized wilderness, untouched by humans, did not shape the thinking and the movements as much as it did the North American counterparts. Naturschutz, the protection of nature, came to be closely associated with the idea of protection of the homeland, which had referred to defense from military enemies before Rudolph used it for his 1897 brochure. So nature and culture were very tightly intertwined in what German conservationists focused on. The notion of a Naturdenkmal, a natural monument, derived from Alexander von Humboldt, combines the idea of natural objects with human-built structures, and natural monuments were considered worthy of protection in exactly the same way as cultural monuments. Natural areas and endangered species became objects of protection along with particular architectural styles and art forms, local and regional customs, and the Eigenart, the particularity of landscapes, that to a term I'll come back to. That's the core concept that shaped early German conservationist thinking. Landschaft, which meant landscapes as they had been historically shaped by human communities in distinctive ways. So beyond the sort of civic engagement that these central ideas catalyzed in the face of modernization and urbanization, there were also a variety of quite divergent legislative initiatives in Germany's multiple regions. And among other things, there was in the Weimar Constitution, there was one, in the preamble, one clause that mentioned nature protection. But comprehensive national environmental legislation was not passed until the National Socialists came to power. Now, this may come as a surprise to mostly left-oriented environmentalists today. We tend to think of the Nazis as so violent and so disdainful of life that it's hard to envision them as conservationists. Yet it was one of Hitler's most notorious associates, Hermann Göring, who helped to pass the Hunting Act the Animal Protection Act in 1933, the Hunting Act in 1934, and the Reichsnaturschutzgesetz, the Nature Protection Act, in 1935. That was the first unified nationwide legislation of its kind in German history. The Animal Protection Law, which outlawed vivisection and cruelty to animals and severely punished it, would probably be called progressive if it had been passed by anybody else in any other period. And there's even, in 1933, this caricature in the satirical magazine Clara Dutch, which depicts Hermann Göring in something like the way that PETA activists are portrayed today. So he's doing the Hitler salute, as are all these animals, the rabbits and the lions and the pigeons all lifting their little wings, because he just helped to pass this anti-vivisection legislation, which this magazine is completely cynical about. I mean, it's titled Eine Kulturtat, a cultural achievement, which they no doubt mean ironically in this context. So it's very startling to see that kind of depiction in this context. Now, you might well be tempted to dismiss the Nazis' passing of comprehensive environmental legislation as no more than a shrewd appropriation of the rhetoric and the cultural capital that the conservationist movement had since the turn of the century. And it's true that the protection of nature, the homeland, and historical patrimony all became yoked to Nazi patriotism, militarism, and imperialist expansion. As is obvious in Walter Darré's propaganda for the German connection to blood and soil, Blut und Boden. The protection and restoration of quote-unquote typically German landscapes was used to legitimize Germany's eastward expansion. And the Nazis sustained efforts at modernization, for example, in the construction of a national highway system, and the focus on the war effort that started a few years after the passing of this law also often overrode environmentalist concerns and entailed brutal transformation of landscapes and exploitation of natural resources. But precisely because of that context, the question, I think, is not really why the Nazis exploited the natural world, but why they bothered to pass laws that, at least in principle, constrained that legislation. And you would have to add to that some Nazi officials and scientists had a genuine commitment to and deep knowledge of the natural world. And not all of the conservationists whose organizations were taken over by the Nazis committed themselves to the new ideological regime. And there's some really detailed and fascinating historical work on this now. The nature protection law so sound in its basic assumption and so untainted by Nazi rhetoric that the newly established Federal Republic of Germany carried it over after World War II as its own legislation. It was challenged in 1957, not because of its ideology and not because it contained any invalid science or errors in the way it addressed environmental problems, but because it attributed powers to the central German government that were no longer constitutional under the new post-war federalism. So it was only that clause 24 that was challenged. Other than that, with the exception of that one clause, the Nazi environmental law remained in force in the Federal Republic until 1976, so another quarter century. Now, between the 1950s and the 70s, the states had environmental power, and so they came up with a variety of nature protection laws of their own. But that fragmentation of responsibility then also led to the call for a unifying legal framework. And meantime, of course, also there had been the rise of initially very varied kinds of environmentalist movements, from the Green Charter in the early 60s to the most famous one, the Green Party, which was founded in 1979. So against the background of vigorous debates about nuclear power, nuclear weapons, pollution, and the role of nature in a nation mostly oriented toward economic growth after World War II, the Parliament passed a new federal law for the protection of nature in 1976 that created a general for environmental protection to which state laws had to adapt. And that new framing law also took into account international treaties for the protection of species such as CITES, to which Germany had become a signatory in 1973. So over the following decades, international treaties led to further modification of the law. I mean, now you get a story that's a little bit similar to the ESA. The reunification of the Federal Republic with the German Democratic Republic in 1989 obviously led to changes, and I do not have time to talk about the Democratic Republic environmental, which is interesting in its own right. The Federal Nature Protection Act was updated again in 2002 during the Green stint as part of the federal government. And the purpose then was to implement as national law the European Community's Birds Directive from 1979 and the Habitats Directive from 1992, which I've put on here. Now, these two directives had as one of their main goals the creation of the Natura 2000 project, which was initiated in 1998, that wanted to gradually create a network of protected areas across the European Union. And then in 2010, the law was modified yet again in kind of boring ways to conform with federal reform that had already been passed in 2006. So that's sort of where we're at in Germany now. So when you look at these two laws as they stand today, one of the most striking differences between the Endangered Species Act and the German Federal Nature Protection Act lies in what they seek to protect. The ESA, as its name indicates, aims to protect those species that have already been identified as imperiled. The purposes of this act are to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be concerned, to provide a for the conservation of such endangered species. And a great deal of the controversy over the implementation of the ESA, as you all know, has revolved around the procedures and the temporal delays that precede the official listing of a species, to the point where some species actually go extinct while they're waiting to be listed. A review of the statistics led Scott et al. To conclude in the early 2000s that listing and recovery planning are implemented when extinction risks have already reached critical levels. Our biggest challenge may not lie in the recovery of endangered species, but in preventing imperiled species from becoming endangered. Now, the German Federal Nature Protection Act does not focus primarily on species at risk. One of its broadest goals, as articulated in paragraph 1, is the protection of nature and landscape in such a way that biological diversity is ensured over the long term. But the tasks of species conservation are only defined much later in the law. As you can see, these are paragraphs that come much later. And it says there, so these tasks are: 1, protecting wild species of animals and plants and their life communities from damage by humans and safeguarding their other essential living conditions. 2, protecting the habitats and landscapes the habitats and biotopes of wild species and animals and plants, as well as 3, restoring displaced wild species of animals and plants in suitable biotopes within their natural ranges. So it's immediately obvious from reading this that the German law understands conservation in a much broader sense than the American ESA. It aims to protect biodiversity at large, and in principle, all wild animals and plants are protected here, regardless of their status. Only the third goal here refers to species that can no longer be found in their original habitats. But interestingly, even then, the language that's used here is not gefährdete Arten. It's not, endangered species. It's verdrängte Arten, so displaced species. And that focus explains some things that might otherwise seem odd. The articles concerning general species conservation include regulations not just concerning non-native species, but also zoos, whereas endangered species, which the German law refers to as especially protected species, only appear in paragraph 44. So in a sense, the German law is far more holistic in its conception of conservation than the American law. And I think that's basically true, but I want to add 2 qualifications to this. The ESA, as well as we saw in the quote that I had on the previous slide, names as its first goal to conserve the ecosystems on which endangered species depend. The addition of the critical habitat requirement in the 70s extended the focus of the law from individual species to the ecological spaces and networks of which they form part. The German law, on the other hand, isn't as inclusive at first. From looking at this slide, you might conclude that you can't pick a flower or shoot a deer in Germany without a permit. The law, in fact, not just allows such actions, it generally exempts agriculture, forestry, hunting, and fishing from its provisions, so long as these activities obey the rules of good professional practice. That's a term that recurs not just in this law, but also in specific laws about agriculture, forestry, hunting, and fishing that sort of complement this law. So since agriculture and fisheries are 2 of the principal contributors to species loss, that means that this exemption limits the power of a law that incredibly powerful. But so even granting that the American and German laws for the protection of endangered species may be shaped by practical implementations more than may be apparent when you just look at the original formulations, their conceptual approach to the problem is strikingly different. And now the cultural and historical reasons for this difference emerge more clearly when you consider that the German law not only concerns itself with biodiversity more than with endangered species, it does not, in fact, mention either biodiversity or endangered species in its title. So the law is called Bundesnaturschutzgesetz, that's sort of the short version, Federal Nature Protection Act, but its full title is Gesetz über Naturschutz und Landesliga, so Act on Nature Protection and Landscape Management. And the law's 3 goals are listed here, so that's the full wording of the paragraph 1. So as you can see, biological diversity, ensuring biological diversity over long term is one goal. Performance and functionality of ecosystems is the second one, although the word that's used here is neither ecology nor ecosystems, but Naturhaushalt. So even though Ökologie is a German coined word, it doesn't appear in this paragraph, including sustainable use of resources. And then thirdly, the diversity, and then there's that word of particularity and beauty and recreational value of nature and landscape. The second goal is really, really broad, and you wonder how the law could even address this, given that it doesn't, in fact, deal with water quality or air quality or anything like that. But the third goal of what this law is about. This formulaic phrase, Natur und Landschaft, nature and landscape, is repeated obsessively in this law as well as a lot of other German legal texts. And its companion, Naturschutz und Landschaftspflege, so nature conservation and landscape management, come up again and again, and they convey the combined concern with species and spaces. Now, you might think at first that, okay, they say landscape, but isn't that more or less the equivalent of the critical habitat designation in the American Endangered Species Act, which is defined as the specific areas within the geographical occupied by the species at the time it is listed, on which are those physical or biological features essential to the conservation of the species and which may require special management considerations or protection. It's much less fun to quote legal texts than novels or poetry, I have to say. But even a cursory look at the Federal Nature Protection Act reveals that it dedicates as much space to the protection of landscapes as to that of species, including a long list of specific conservation designations. Put a selection here. This is a selection, right? Okay, so we have nature conservation area, natural monuments, biosphere reserves, landscape protection areas, and on and on. There's like 12 or 13 different designations. These are neither simply critical habitat, nor are they natural space just considered aesthetically or pictorially, as you might think from the English cognate landscape. What is at the core of this Nature Protection Act really is the old notion of landscape from the late 19th century. That is landscape as it has been transformed by humans and given distinctive character. That concept has been central for German conservationism since the as the environmental historian Stefan Körner has pointed out, who says in traditional nature conservation, at least in the strand that derives from the tradition of homeland protection, unlike in the United States, is widespread in Germany, the pristineness of the environment and thereby the role of non-native species is measured by the logic of the cultural identity of humanly altered landscapes, even if the rhetoric is about ecosystem functions. And in fact, Körner has been consistently critical of environmental rhetoric in Germany for using scientific rhetoric to really mean a very specifically historically emerging, historically conditioned notion of humanly transformed landscapes. And we actually have a little bit of light here. I'm beginning to not be able to see my script anymore. Great, thank you. Well, just having a little more daylight will also be. So he has argued repeatedly that the specifically German notion of landscape is actually simply equated in the official discourse of the environmental movement with the scientific notion of the intact ecosystem. And so he has argued for actually separating that back out and developing a progressive notion of landscape and homeland that wouldn't fall into the old conservative and indeed fascist uses of it. But his critique certainly would apply to the German Federal Nature Protection Act, where one of the major functions of species conservation is to preserve intact or to restore the Eigenart, the particularity of landscapes. And so that prominence of the concept of Landschaft in German environmental law distinguishes it not just from the US law, but also from EU legislation, in which you are much more likely to find terms such as habitat or ecosystem. Landschaft has a long philosophical and cultural tradition that associates the character of a people with the place it inhabits. And you can trace it back to Johann Gottfried Herder's late 18th century philosophy of cultural difference, and the philosophers here will know more about this than I do. And even though the notion of a primeval landscape before human intervention occasionally appears in German conservationism, far more prominent are landscapes that have acquired their characteristic profile, at least in due to human manipulation. So they're what is called Kulturlandschaften, or humanly altered landscapes. So the German Federal Nature Protection Law of 2010 must be understood in terms of national culture and history. But of course, at the same time, it is also a product of international legal frameworks. So laws for the protection of endangered species in many countries today have to take into account international treaties, and Germany is no exception. It's a signatory to CITES, to the Berne Convention of 1979, the Bonn Convention from the same year, the Birds Directive, the Habitats Directive, and so forth. And so Germany has adjusted its legislation to conform to the demands of international species conservation treaties and laws. Now, the two most important conservation directives of the European Union, the Birds and Habitats Directives, both have two sets of provisions, one that deals with habitat protection and one that deals with species protection. Under these two directives, conservation areas were created with the ultimate goal of generating a continent-wide ecological protection network called Natura 2000. This network, which currently includes approximately 18% of EU territory, is meant to preserve both habitats and species, and protect species primarily through the conservation of habitats. As of 2013, approximately 200 habitat types and over 1,000 animal and plant species. Now, the areas that form part of Natura 2000 are not wilderness areas. They can include significant human use, and the European Court of Justice has been pretty good about enforcing the limits on those uses. The current German law conforms to the Habitats Directive, but as you might expect, the language of the two legal documents differs quite substantially. Both of them emphasize biodiversity as well as, to a lesser extent, sustainability, but the Habitats Directive uses none of the language referring to the care, appearance, and particularity of landscape of the German law. Instead, you find the scientific rhetoric of natural habitats and habitat types, and the reason for that is obvious. That's obviously a language that appealed to the European legislators more, and it seemed to them more neutral than terms with cultural histories that might have resonated quite differently in the EU's many nations. But the Habitats Directive shares with the Federal Nature Protection Act an emphasis on the conservation of particular types of places as the principal tool for conserving both endangered ecosystems and species. And so in the EU directives, this is a little more balanced, but in the German law, you could say that the subordination of critical habitat to species conservation is practically inverted. Species conservation is a means for preserving landscapes. In the EU legislation, it seems more balanced. But the Dutch legal scholar Jonathan Verschuren has commented that habitat conservation in the US Endangered Species Act is always aimed at the conservation of a certain species, while in the EU, habitat conservation can be aimed at a certain type of habitat as well. So again, you find that sort of prioritizing of habitat. The latter approach seems to be more function-oriented and thus more precautionary because it aims at protecting habitat regardless of whether a certain species on that site is endangered. So that's his sort of legal comment. In the language of the Habitats Directive, the conservation of natural spaces does not so much grow out of particular cultural traditions as it seeks to create one, as a byproduct, you might say, of conservation. The threatened habitats and species form part of the community's natural heritage, the preamble to the Habitats Directive states. And since the threats to them are often of a transboundary nature, it is necessary to take measures at community level in order to conserve them. Along similar lines, the European Court of Justice has often emphasized that the management of the common heritage is entrusted to the member states in their respective territories. Now, this idea that the biodiversity of ecosystems and species constitutes a kind of national patrimony is common in environmental rhetoric of various countries. And in fact, the Endangered Species Act contains at least one sentence that is similar in nature, where it says the act is meant to comply with the international treaties the U.S. has signed, but also to better safeguard for the benefit of all citizens the nation's heritage in fish, wildlife, and plants. So that's pretty much par for the course for a nation. But it's somewhat more adventurous in the case of a sprawling multinational conglomerate such as the European Union. In this expanded context, it is meant to create the idea of a shared ancestry and tradition more than it attests to an already existing one. the 2007 amendment to the Habitats Directive seeks to give this shared heritage a somewhat more concrete shape when it defines natural habitats. And natural habitats in the EU language are always either natural or semi-natural, that is humanly altered, or cultural. And so it includes among habitat types of community interest, not just those that are reduced to a small range or in danger of disappearing, but also ones, and this is the quote that I've put here, that present outstanding examples of typical characteristics of one or more of the 9 following biogeographical regions: Alpine, Atlantic, Black Sea, Boreal, Continental, Macaronesian, Mediterranean, Pannonian, and Steppe. When I read that, I went back and had to look up some of these, and when you look them up, you realize very quickly that they're biogeographical at some level, and then all of them also have deep cultural history, so they're actually weird combinations of ecology, geography, and culture. So these 9 designations combine the cultural with the ecological, and I think they can be read as one of the Habitat Directive's attempts to give flesh to the skeleton of the community's natural heritage. Now, let me sum all this up and draw a few conclusions. So, one, how we engage with species at risk now is conditioned by histories, and without knowing these, it's hard to understand the terms on which communities engage with scenarios like biodiversity loss, like this difference between the emphasis on species and on landscapes in the US and Germany. 2, history and culture also shape how the science involved in environmental crisis is understood. That was Körner's point, that you can only understand the way in which the science is interpreted in the German context if you know something about the history. 3, these cultures of extinction are tightly related to politics. That's most obvious here in the ties of conservation to a certain image of the nation, and in the case of the EU, also a certain image of supranational community. And then 4, engagements with endangered species can also be read as reflections on how we perceive humans' role and humans' agency in multi-species networks and ecological systems. All of the laws that I've discussed here justify the protection of non-human species in terms of their value for humans. They're anthropocentric, you could say. And in the case of a law, is it really possible to imagine anything else? I mean, aren't laws by definition expressions of human value? Well, that's true, but it is interesting that the German law actually has one clause right at the beginning that does affirm something a little different. So in paragraph 1, under the heading of Goals of Nature Protection and Landscape Management, it says, nature and landscape, because of their intrinsic value and as foundation for human life and health, also in view of responsibility for future generations, are to be protected in inhabited as well as non-inhabited areas in such a way as to ensure these 3 goals that I discussed earlier. Now, that because of their intrinsic value has been widely commented upon by legal scholars, it's tantamount to a legal affirmation that nature has value in and of itself, regardless of its human uses. These kinds of affirmations are still pretty rare in environmental laws, but as you may know, statements affirming the rights of Mother Nature have in the last few years been included in the constitutions of Bolivia and Colombia, and in each of these cases, they're meant as a nod toward indigenous ways of thinking about the more than human world. And the Bolivian nature protection law actually also has a clause that says it's the duty of the state and society to, and I think I have that quote here, although just in Spanish, to guarantee the right of each person and living being to enjoy a healthy and pleasant environment in the development and exercise of its activities and faculties, right? So it's even in the nature protection law also. In the German as well as the Bolivian and Colombian cases, it's to date very hard to know what such statements legally mean. They don't really translate into anything concrete that is legally actionable that you can take to a court of law. But they do anticipate a moment, and in some respects that may be a post-human or multi-species moment, in which the protection of biodiversity is not just a way of protecting our human heritage, but where we ourselves are envisioned as part of nature's multi-species patrimony. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, so I will field them. I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. A lot of fascinating things there. I didn't quite get the term, I'm sorry, I don't speak German, but I noticed that you made reference to one of the terms of like nature household or natural household.
Ja, Naturhaushalt.
Okay. And the German, I think, is different, but is there some kind of conceptual resonance there with the ecology of Tackle and that notion of oikos that Nick was talking about?
There is. I mean, that's clearly, it's clearly that language, and I don't know why it doesn't actually use the term ecologie. And I don't know if that's if there's a way in which they stay away from vocabulary that is perceived to be too scientific, but it's puzzling because that is not. I mean, they stay away from terms that are obviously translated from other languages, but this one is originally a German term, so you would think that Ökologie could have come up in this law. It does not. I mean, it's Naturhaushalt, and it's that older vocabulary that is used consistently in the text of the law, even as of 2010.
So this is in the preamble, right?
No, this is just the first paragraph of the Federal Nature Protection Law. It's not the preamble. It's just the first paragraph of it, the first clause, clause 1.
But you don't say, but it's not actionable in law. Because we have the physics guy in the Canadian, but it's in the preamble. Remember, people said it's just a soft because it'll never be in court. The preamble is never in court. Were you saying this also would never be actionable?
It isn't because, and I mean, I was really interested by this, and so I started reading some of the legal commentary on this, because I figured, just as a literary scholar, I have to know what the legal scholars say about this, and everybody says this is really interesting, and it's a remarkable move to put that in there, and it is in the law, but it's not clear how you would, I mean, how would you actually transact this? I mean, when would you make that claim? How would you make that sort of suable, and how would you bring that to trial? That seems to be sort of the problem with it. Just as in the case of the rights of nature, I mean, it's just not clear what that means. So does a river have a right to a certain volume of water? Does a forest have a right to a certain number or diversity of trees or tree species, right? I mean, that's the problem with this kind of vocabulary. I mean, it indicates it is a value affirmation, but of course, for somebody actually to be able to say in court, this is, what I'm suing for, you'd have to know how that translates. And from the legal commentary that I've seen, nobody has done that, and nobody knows how exactly you would do that. So it's there, and it'll be interesting to watch whether somebody does at some point.
Question, Doug?
Thank you, that was great. I understand that at least in forestry laws and so forth in the 1930s, ingrained aspects of eugenics and cultural purity into the races of trees that were allowed to be grown in German forestry and so forth. Has any of that ever hold over? Is that all gone? Or is it still in forestry that having trees that are
And that was not even in the general nature protection law. I mean, if any language like that had been in there, the Federal Republic would not have taken it over. I mean, there was real anxiety over getting rid of anything in official language and titles that smacked of continuation of the Nazi legacy. So it is very, and it's one of the, I don't know of many pieces of legislation that were taken over wholesale like that, and that actually, endured through the protests of the 1960s. And really, were updated in the 1970s mostly to reflect, some newer science and then the new international treaty. So there's none of that language in the national law. No, it doesn't have any of that language in it. And I mean, that it's interesting because it also, it gives a somewhat more nuanced and complicated picture of Nazi science. And I mean, when you read some of like Walter von Schirnichen, who was a Nazi, he wrote a well-known book in 1942 on nature protection. And it's actually, a lot of that stuff you and I could probably, without much problem, agree with. There's a lot of really good science and a lot of genuine commitment to nature. Then you have the sort of more, Goering was just a fanatic hunter. Anything concerned with hunting and protection of species in that context appealed to him. So in the law itself, no, there's no eugenics whatsoever. Otherwise, it wouldn't have passed to the day it passed 1945. So it's interesting how that plays. So ideas of typically German landscape and eradicating other kinds of species and people and configurations, landscapes was rampant in the sort of wartime rhetoric, and in the justifications for taking over Poland, marching east and sort of Germanifying those kinds of landscapes and rescuing benighted populations that had mishandled them for so long. There it's obvious, but none of that made its way into the text of the law. So it's just complicated. It's not, there's not one sort of judgment or assessment that covers all of it.
Yeah, and yet that notion of genetic purity sort of sneaks into a lot of the debates that we have here about whether we're dealing with a hybrid or not, and for protection or not, and so forth. The context in which I would bring up for my students this historical contrast. Not to embrace the German model of genetics to declare the purity of species, but that in some sense, we've never quite wrestled with the species question that you earlier said defines that as in this debate and whose tactic they have to use it.
And it's not just hybrid species, it's also invasive species. And, at one moment when I was writing the article that this is based on, I thought I really wanted to focus on the problem of invasive species in different environmental laws. And it doesn't really, it's not a prominent part of this law. It comes up, but it's sort of one of many paragraphs. There's no particular focus on it. And so I thought, again, I went to the legal commentary, and there's a woman, a legal scholar, who wrote a 400-page book on how the problem of invasive species is dealt with in current German law. And so she looks not just at the federal nature protection law, but also the agricultural law, the law on genetically modified organisms, the forestry law, all of these, and it just becomes unbelievably complicated. And she concludes that 450-page book by saying these laws are completely inconsistent with each other. They say things that contradict each other. There is no consistent legal practice here concerning invasive species that is laid down in the various laws and in the way in which they play together. And at that moment, I sort of threw up my hands and I said, okay, if even legal scholars cannot come up with any sort of general conclusions about how does German law look at invasive species, then I certainly can. And it's just not a good basis for starting the comparison. So, but you're right. One would think that it would be there. It's there less than one assumes.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut us off this conversation here, unfortunately. I'm sure we keep going along. We have to keep moving. Thank you very much, Dr. Heise.